important to record.
Yeah, that's right. The most essential thing. It looks like it's recording now, so we are now recording. All right. Well, I'll kick it off. So, hello, I'm Dan O'Brien.
And I'm Matty Nicole O'Brien.
And we're from Diplosphere. So Diplosphere is an independent think tank based in Wellington.
So because we live on a sphere, we believe that we shouldn't look at the world from one angle. The problem today is we hear either one side of the story or the other side.
Yes. And we're very lucky today to have with us the Right Honourable Helen Clark to provide just those perspectives on some of the things that are happening here in the world today. Diplosphere has been around for about 10 years. We've had over 10,000 people through our doors on all sorts of topics. And we're going to kick it off with Matty talking to you, Helen, about some of your story, what drives you today. Then we'll look at the current world and then finish off with some of the future. But first of all, I just want to quickly introduce you to the podcast. So Helen Clark was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008. During her 9 years as Prime Minister, New Zealand enjoyed strong economic growth, low unemployment, and significant investment in public services. And the government set clear objectives on sustainable development and climate action. Helen Clark became the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme in April 2009 and chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programs and departments working on development issues. She was the first woman to assume these positions, which she held for a full term, 2 terms and 8 years before standing down in April 2017. And we also saw, of course, recently the Elders, which you're part of, and the foundation, the Helen Clark Foundation. So those are 2 other things, lots on your plate. But welcome, Helen, to our podcast.
Thank you, Dan and Matty.
So Helen, what makes you tick? You had such an amazing career, spanning high-level politics, international development, advocacy. What drives you and what continues to drive you today?
I've been in top gear for decades. So the issues that interest me are many. And I think it's important to put a stake in the ground on what you think is important and try to work for a better world. I've always operated on the principle that jaw is better than war. So I'm always looking for, ways to promote dialogue, increasingly these days within New Zealand itself, which is in serious need of civil discourse, but also at the international level, where we see the failure of dialogue and diplomacy now ruining the lives of countless numbers of people. Think for a moment of the number of people around our world who are forcibly displaced from their homes. It's over 1% of humanity. That's an enormous number of people. And much of it is conflict. It's people driven from their homes by the conflict around them. They're either refugees or they're internally displaced persons, and neither is an enviable position to be in.
We talk about the Middle East. I mean, this is on top of mind for many people. So what are you about that?
So I've just been in New York around the events at the General Assembly, the 79th General Assembly high-level week, as I think a number of people have noticed. And I spent 9 days there, still recovering from exhaustion, actually, because you go from breakfast to dinners. One of the very first thing I did when I got there was, on behalf of the Elders, address the UN Security Council. The Elders is called in to brief, partly because the organisation is held in respect, and also because it will tell truth to power. It will remind member states what their obligations are. And the statement I made was based on years of focus by the Elders on the Israel-Palestinian issues. And the substance of the statement was, would the Security Council and member states of the UN, of the General Assembly, actually uphold the resolutions of the Security Council and uphold the international judicial and legal processes, which have come under attack for doing their job. So I specifically referred to the resolution which was passed in December 2016, which deemed the Security Council deemed the settlements to be illegal in the occupied Palestinian territories, now reinforced, of course, by the International Court of Justice advisory opinion deeming the occupation as a whole to be illegal. I also referred to the resolution of June this year, where the Security Council did call for a full, immediate and complete ceasefire. Neither of these resolutions, of course, upheld. And then with respect to the International Court of Justice, it made a number of provisional measures and rulings going back earlier this year in response to the South African case, not observed the rulings that it made. And then, of course, we have the process underway with the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor has asked for indictments against named individuals from both Israel and Hamas. And the ICC came under serious attack for even asking for that. Right. So our message was respect international law and institutions and processes. Otherwise, we're all doomed.
Yes.
And you often hear New Zealand politicians talking about the international rule of law. Well, unfortunately, just about every state on earth is very selective in how it upholds it. And we need to get in behind our international court, our international criminal court, and the Security Council resolutions, and try to use them to make a better outcome.
Yeah, just on that, I think surely for a smaller country like New Zealand, we have more interest. We have of these systems working. Of course, bigger countries can try and take exception in certain cases because they have the means to do so. But smaller and medium-sized countries should be great advocates of the system. I listened to that speech, and one thing you said also was talking about the conflict management approach that currently has been used up to date and how that's failed. Can you just sort of, in broad strokes, talk about that approach and what would be a better approach? You talked about a conflict management approach, that term specifically.
Yeah. So the reality is that up until now, and maybe going forward, sadly, the UN processes have had almost no influence on the relations between Israel and the Palestinians, despite resolutions and fine words. The UN has been pushed aside from any attempt at a peace process. It's come from others. Occasionally the US gets busy, but for the most part, I think it's been inclined to stand back and let things rumble on. And then you get a terrible crisis. I mean, how many Gaza wars have there been? This being the most devastating by far, where people say the key issue has to be addressed. And that is that the Palestinians need statehood. And so stop trying to manage conflict at a low level. And it's not now at a low level. It's at sort of red peak heat, and start to look for the processes that will lead to resolution. This can't be managed as a conflict. It's out of control. And as we see now, the regional spillover with Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran, this is catastrophic. And we need serious diplomacy. Now, I do think the Arab states hold a lot of the key to this. The United States, under both recent administrations, has been very keen on these Abrahamic Accords, which would have seen a reconciliation between Arab states and Israel. And let's face it, going back some 40 plus years, there was a settlement with Jordan. There was a settlement with Egypt. New Zealand forces are in the Sinai to this day, policing that settlement. In quite recent years, United Arab Emirates has exchanged ambassadors with Israel. But the big prize is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is hanging tough. And there was an initiative announced at the UN last week between the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Faisal, and the Norwegian foreign minister, where it was quite clear that the Saudis are not going to recognize without that move to Palestinian statehood. So that should really be focusing minds in Washington, D.C., whichever administration is around.
That makes sense. So the approach, the sort of trying to keep things on the boil with a conflict management process, not getting to the nub of the issue, which is effectively resolution.
And further to that, I mean, Israel will never enjoy security in a neighborhood where everyone is opposed to it. So it sees itself as somehow exceptional. The truth is, until it gets peace with its neighbours, its people will never know security. As we know, long-range records, missiles, and it's not such long range to come from Lebanon or the Gaza Strip or from Iran. The people of Israel are now living in permanent insecurity, almost a permanent state of war. This is not a future for anybody. And before we even start on the plight of the Palestinians, his position is very, very dire. So something has to cut through this if we're to stop these cycles of wars, misery, killing, injury. It's shocking.
Yes, and I'll just take one last comment on this topic before we move on. And on the current news from this morning, a very worrying news of sort of 100+ missiles coming in retaliation from Iran hitting Israel. What do you think are possible escalations, and what should our small country voice be doing in this sort of situation? And what are your thoughts there?
Our small country voice should be for an urgent ceasefire on all scores and steps to be taken towards Palestinian statehood, with a state living side by side with Israel in peace. And there's some quite creative thinking around now about what that could look like. With 700,000 settlers now in the West Bank, is the demand that they all return, or is that there's some kind of right of residence where they don't have citizenship in the Palestinian state but have Israeli citizenship, but you have the two states working quite closely together? That may seem idealistic at the moment, but it's what people on both sides of the line in Palestine and Israel are discussing. But I'm also concerned that a lot of the very one-sided commentary we hear, when Israel kills the senior Palestinian negotiator in Iran, Iran then is told it can't retaliate. When Israel has the pager attack on Lebanon and then takes out the leader of Hezbollah, and I understand also a single Iranian commander, there are then threats issued to Iran that it cannot retaliate or others will retaliate. I mean, can we all just take a step back here? We're in an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. We know what happens if this goes on. Some of the Iranian missiles will get through. More of the residual Hezbollah missiles will get through. More Israeli bombing attacks will kill more people. I mean, this is a catastrophe, and it's on our watch. And I really think our diplomats, the diplomats of every country with a voice, need to be saying enough. This kind of approach cannot continue.
There's that escalation ladder they talk about. And just one comment from me on that: I see that our government has publicly condemns the one side but not the other, and that's
the problem. We have always prided ourselves on having an even-handed approach, and to some extent that has prevailed. For example, our foreign minister's comments at the UN on the subject, I'd find very little to disagree with. But I think at a level above that, we've seen these statements where our Prime Minister has made statements with Prime Ministers of Canada and Australia, which are well subpar where New Zealand diplomacy has been on these issues. So, it's a very precious thing to keep your reputation for acting on a basis of principle and international law and what's fair. And I think, that there's a danger that we're departing from that. I think, for example, entering into support for the bombing of the Houthis was quite wrong. I've followed Yemeni affairs for many years since I was at UNDP. I've visited the country. I've seen the Houthis withstand years of bombing by the Saudi Arabians and United Arab Emirates. Frankly, a few bombing raids from the US and friends, supported by New Zealand, aren't going to stop the Houthis. What the Houthis want is an end to the conflict in Gaza. Right? Again, we keep coming back to, can we please address the root problems
root cause of it?
And so in a few days, the Americans will go to the ballot and elect a new president. a Trump 2.0 could upend things from Ukraine to China, and having potentially a first female president of the United States, and a woman of color could also shift things up. So my question is, how could either a Kamala Harris 1.0 or Trump 2.0 change things for the future, and how should New Zealand prepare? Because to my view, the first time Donald Trump got elected, New Zealand wasn't really taking it seriously. So how to avoid any surprises and get ready as a small country at the bottom of the world?
Well, clearly the United States is divided down the middle, and it's quite possible that you'll get a result where a candidate wins the popular vote and loses the electoral college. Either way, so it's a toss-up, and as we know, it's a few hundreds of thousands of votes in a few strategic counties and states which are going to make the difference. My next point, though, would be that sadly, I think on some of the key issues of concern to us, the differences may not be as great as they seem. For example, the antagonism to China, the strategic contestation, seems set to continue under either administration, unless with Kamala Harris's vice president, who has spent quite a bit of time in China and knows people, as colleagues and friends, unless after the elections, a completely different foreign policy team and a different way of thinking about how to relate to China as a major emerging power. Secondly, on Ukraine, I'm totally in Ukraine's corner, right? I'm devastated by what has happened to Ukraine. I do happen to think that whoever wins, Ukraine will come under huge pressure to settle wherever the line of control is. And that's why this summer and autumn fighting has been so critical for Ukraine, not to lose more, because clearly major European countries like Germany are sick of paying for it. The Americans, heavily indebted as they are probably sick of paying for it as well. And at some point, I think either the Trump administration or a Harris one, Ukraine will come under pressure to settle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a peace settlement. I think we're acutely aware that an armistice has run in the Korean War since 1953 without a peace settlement. But I can't see Ukraine continuing to be armed the way it is, and I feel for them. Thirdly, on Israel-Palestine, which is rather interesting, I think President Trump prides himself on the art of the deal. He really prizes the Saudi Arabia relationship. He's been very much in Israel's corner, but he keeps saying he wants a deal. Can't go on like this. So, what is he thinking of? Secondly, when I was in New York, moving around, listening to people, what I was told, what I heard, was that the team around Kamala Harris are very concerned about the way the US has handled the Israel-Palestine conflict, including over the past almost year since 7th October. Of course, nothing can be said now because it may fuel Trump's rhetoric. Yes. But it's possible that we might see a more muscular approach to from the US on the issues, because at the moment it looks like Israel's the superpower and the US is trotting along behind saying me too. It reminds you of that old story about Bill Clinton after one of, no doubt, a number of unsatisfactory meetings with Netanyahu, when Clinton said to his aides at the end of the meeting, "Who the hell is the superpower around here?" Well, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Objectively, I mean, they arm Israel, they've supported it for years, but somehow have no influence. This is not sustainable.
Yes. I mean, that shows that sort of dictum, all foreign policy starts home and domestic politics matters. And I think in the case of Israel-Palestine, it's absolutely the case with the United States. I will just thinking now, I know we've only got about 10 minutes left, but thinking about New Zealand and what we can represent, Aotearoa New Zealand can strive to represent globally, and kind of looking forward a bit more. Where do you think, if we look over the next 10, 15 years, what would be a good role for New Zealand? And what would the international, like an ideal international system look like? What should we strive to work towards?
So I think we need to think about where we've been successful in the past. I would think the independent New Zealand foreign policy probably got its greatest boost from the nuclear-free policy. And let's not think the nuclear disarmament issues have gone away. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has that, minutes to midnight clock moving ever closer. So we should really get back into the frame on the discussions around nuclear weapons, which is a clear and present threat. President Putin's threatened them, the use in Ukraine and around, as have some of his acolytes. I think if we're looking at those sort of treaties around, quote, weapons of mass destruction, the Biological Weapons Convention is weak, much weaker than, say, the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we might, put a bit of effort into that. I think this whole arms control architecture is extremely important, and it's come under a lot of pressure from the time of the Trump presidency and now the Putin reaction with what's happened in Ukraine. So the last thing we need is an unraveling arms control infrastructure. I think on trade, obviously New Zealand's long punched above its weight on that, but our international trading system's also in some dysfunction. Not least because our great friend the United States has undermined the appellate system, which, and if you don't have a proper appeals system, then that tends to paralyze the organization. So some creative thinking about how to get WTO negotiations back on track. It's absurd to think that the hard yards on the only existing trade round of the old GATT that succeeded was the Uruguay one, which the legwork was mostly done on when Mike Moore was the trade minister at the end of the 1980s. So, I mean, and now the World Trade Rules system doesn't cover, basically the last 3 decades plus of what's happened in the global economy. So that's a bit irrelevant. I think, look, if you had a blank sheet of paper, wouldn't I love to see New Zealand in the Southern Hemisphere as a companion country to Norway in the Northern one, which was known for its dedication to bringing people together to broker agreements and peace. Don McKinnon did this very successfully with the Burnham talks between the Bougainvilleans and Papua New Guinea back in the late 90s. But it's not something we put a lot of effort into. It would be nice to think of us as an honest broker, but to be an honest broker, you also have to be seen to be independent. And I'm on the record as saying that I am very concerned about the slippage away from the independent and principled foreign policy and the slippage back into being a sort of yes sir, where Uncle Sam goes, we go kind of mentality. So I think to be credible and putting ourselves forward as an honest broker, we have to really safeguard the independent stance.
Yes.
So talking about foreign policy, what was the best foreign policy decision you have made during your career as a prime minister?
Oh, without question, not being involved in the invasion of Iraq.
Yes.
And it's not that it wasn't sounded out with us, but we used our own judgment. Independent sources of information at high levels, including in the UN system. When I went to see Kofi Annan at the end of 2002, he was very clear to me, as were his senior officials, including Hans Blix, former Swedish Conservative PM who ran the arms verification mission, the head of political affairs, Sir Kieran Prendergast, that there was no legal foundation for an invasion. And we took that advice rather than, the whispering in our ear from across the ditch, London and Washington, D.C. And, time proved us right. It was not supported by the major opposition in New Zealand at the time. They condemned it. But that decision has stood the test of time. Out of the complete disarray in Iraq following the invasion, where one of the first things the invading force did was disband the Ba'ath Party and disband the Iraqi army, particularly when you disband the power control systems in a country, you leave a vacuum, and the vacuum was eventually led to ISIS. Not to put too fine a point on it, the invasion of Mosul, the terrible things that happened to the Yazidis, ISIS. Then, of course, its influence through Syria. And Iraq as well, dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. And the legacy of that's still playing out in those wretched detention camps where the ISIS widows and families are absolutely trapped and can't leave and have no prospects at all. So without doubt, the best decision was not to have a bar of it.
Well, that's a really interesting, and I know Terence O'Brien, my father, spoke a lot about that time as well, and effectively the importance of having an independent view. I wonder, bringing it to today, of course, there's the big debate around Pillar 2 of AUKUS, and hearing those whispering in the airs and the independent viewpoints you just alluded to there back in 2003. Do you think the government is getting those independent viewpoints today? What can we do to encourage more debate? Of course, I've seen you and Don Brash have written about it. But what must we do in this country to really elevate the debate on AUKUS and Pillar 2, and how it might affect New Zealand?
So when I talk to some people in media, I know there's a feeling that Kiwis are just completely preoccupied by other things at the moment. There's a lot of joblessness, a lot of stuff's coming at them. It's a new government, which is a radical departure from the past in many ways, but it's a radical departure from the past on this. There's almost an unthinking, willingness to sign up to whatever the United States wants, and that is a concern to me. And these stories come thick and fast. For example, a New Zealand Navy tanker lamely limps behind an Australian destroyer through the Taiwan Strait in the last week or so. We're in those exercises in the West Philippine Sea, whether it's the same tanker or frigate, I don't know. There's been a lot of detail. We're with the US in landmine clearance exercises on a northern beach. Well, it's just endless, and AUKUS is part of this. What concerned me going back to the February ministerial between the New Zealand and Australian Foreign Affairs and Defence ministers was the invoking of ANZUS as the basis of the defence relationship with the United States. Well, this is ridiculous. We have had a closer defence relationship with Australia for a long time. We don't need to invoke ANZUS, but invoking ANZUS is a way of backdoor saying, oh, well, this is still relevant, and AUKUS then becomes another pillar on AUKUS. I mean, the debate in Australia is I think, getting much more coverage than here, partly because Australia risks losing its independent submarine capacity. Yeah. And there is a school of thought, as you heard when Hugh White came to New Zealand, that for the cost of nuclear submarines, which they may never get because the clause for the US to supply them has a huge waiver, yes, which is only if they can spare them themselves, and they can't build enough for themselves. But it's like buying a pig at a poke. You may eventually get 8 nuclear submarines, but for the money, you could have had many, many more yes, conventionally powered submarines with potentially a program to turn them out of the Australian shipyards in Sydney and Melbourne. So in Australia, they see the real threat of AUKUS to their independent, to the extent that they have an independent defence and foreign policy, that they see it as losing their sovereign capacity to deploy an adequate submarine fleet. So all I would say to Kiwis is, have a very good look at this. We're being sold on the idea that Pillar 2 of AUKUS would give us access to a whole lot of sophisticated military technologies. Well, hello, do we need them? Yes. Can we afford them? What are the implications of New Zealand signing up to this with its industries in support? Do we want to be known for developing industries that are part of a military-industrial complex? It may make people look at Rocket Lab and some of the others yes, in a rather different light. I note that there is now a group of New Zealand companies that are coming out for AUKUS because they see the business opportunities. Well, is this really where we want to be? That we go down that track because there might be some dollars in it. And frankly, the few dollars you might pick up from tech companies prepared to go down the military route is nothing compared to the potential loss of export markets in China if China takes huge offence at this.
You've seen that, and I was at a speech by the Minister Todd McClay 2 weeks ago, where he talked about doubling exports for New Zealand, and it's going to China on steroids, but it just doesn't add up with the right hand, left hand. It seems the government's saying one thing with the right hand, the other in the left, and there's no sort of middle point between the two. So the debate certainly needs to keep on happening. I have one more question on that before perhaps we start to wrap up, because I know we're short on time. I just think that idea, like invoking ANZUS, the language, the officialdom, there is no public mandate to sort of move forward here. So how has this come about in a small, hopefully functioning democracy like New Zealand, where officials are sort of leading us up this perhaps primrose path without public debate? How can this even happen in this country?
Well, none of this featured in the New Zealand election campaign.
Yeah.
When people voted for a change of government, they had no idea that there would be a radical change in the posture of New Zealand foreign policy. And there's something profoundly undemocratic about that. What I learned from my political experience was that saying one thing and doing another in the end has a devastating impact on you. I was a junior member of the Labour caucus when we went to government in 1984. People did not know Rogernomics was about to happen. To be honest, we didn't. Taken by surprise, and there was a long-term cost to that. And as leader of the opposition in the 90s, I had to, basically turn us back from the course that has put us on and re-establish Labour as a credible social democratic party that could win an election. And then my mantra was, say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't overpromise, over-deliver. Yeah. So we're in a situation now where the government is doing things that people were never told about. And, it might not, ring bells initially, but over time, these breaches of trust become very corrosive, A, for the government's political standing, but B, also for trust of the system. And I remember by 1999, when we were coming to the end of 9 years in government, New Zealanders didn't really believe anyone anymore. And you had to say, look, I'm not going to do things I said I wouldn't. I'm going to do these things that I'll say I'll do. And, it was almost like they had to take you on trust because their trust had been let down so badly before. So that's the territory we're in, I think.
Yes. Well, I'll hand over to Matty to start wrapping things up. Yeah.
So we discussed you're a member of the Elders, founded by Nelson Mandela, and who said, it always seems impossible until it is done. So what seems impossible today, which can be done according to you?
Well, a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. And, look, we all know the obstacles. The Israeli public seems in no mood for this at the moment, and nor are we seeing in the wings the sort of leadership that might stare that down and say, hand on heart, I've got to tell you, people of my country, that we're on a doomed course unless we change. Yitzhak Rabin was brave enough to do that in signing the Oslo Accords. He was then assassinated by an extremist in Israel, which was tragic. General Sharon, who became prime minister, was brave enough to say, I've got to withdraw from the occupied Gazan territory, and I think had more withdrawal and a deal in sight before he was tragically struck down by a debilitating stroke and never spoke or acted again. So, but we have to live in hope that there will come leadership that can contemplate that. I think with that sea change in Israel, you would see a Palestinian leadership that can negotiate. The leader many look to has been in jail for years, Marwan Barghouti, and we're told that he is someone who could bring together all the factions under the PLO umbrella. And I guess that's why he continues to be detained, because if you have a regime in Israel that's not interested in peace, you don't want a peacemaker running a PLO. But, it seems impossible, but with all the, actors coming together, the US, the Europeans, the Arab states, whoever, let's not overlook the significance of China also as a broker in these kinds of things. Maybe it can happen, and if it doesn't, we know the alternative. More of what we've seen over not just the period since 7 October, but actually for decades.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Helen Clark.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a huge privilege to have you with us at Diplosphere.
Yes, and we'd love if you want to say a few words about the foundation as well and some of your hopes with it over the next few years. Please feel free. If we missed anything that you'd like to point out, let us know. Yeah.
Well, perhaps the last word on the foundation. It was actually established by my husband. I'm a patron, and we've had it obviously professionally run by two exceptionally talented mid-career people, both out of foreign affairs, and there's really been a range of terrific reports published on policy issues that are important to New Zealand and need and can be addressed by both parties in a sensible way if there's a will. It was good to see Chris Bishop embrace the infrastructure report, for example. And I think we need much more cross-party dialogue on infrastructure. As well as the quality reports and briefings, we have done a lot of webinars. And they not just around the issues of the reports, but obviously we do quite a bit on foreign policy because I've got a big interest in that. And there's a Kiwi constituency that wants to know and cares. And next week I'll be doing a webinar with Peter Bale, journalist, and I'll be talking about what came out of the UN General Assembly and what the chatter there was. So I like to think we're performing a public interest function. And of course we welcome members if anyone has the energy or interest to go to the website.
That's great. And we'd love to continue collaborating with you. And I have a couple of ideas, perhaps I'll send in an email afterwards regarding specifically the AUKUS debate and how we can sort of promote that debate in the country. But do realize that our time is now at an end. But thank you very much again from the whole of Brian family and from Diplosphere.
Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye now.
Thank you, Anno.